Hello everyone, we would like to explain about language and autism in terms of pragmatics and the theory of mind. Their members are Made Seri, Ramawati, Fitriyani and Kadek Wahyutriyuni. Let's start. The first one is about narrative, pragmatics and social recognition. Narratives are created for an audience such as films are made to be seen, books are made to be read, and the stories are told specifically to the listener. For this reason, there is an inherent connection between the study of how we create and understand narratives and pragmatics, which is the study of language as used in social contexts. So, narrative competence can define as the ability to both tell and understand about the story. It requires an understanding not only from the events or the characters, but also from the relationship between the person who creates the narratives and the audience who will receive it. Storytellers must be sensitive to the information that their audience needs to be understood and enjoy the story, while readers and or listeners need to attend to the details that a narrative's creator intended to be a central focus. Next, about narrative and the theory of mind. So here, pragmatic communication, narrative competence, and everyday social functioning are require an advanced ability to consider the minds of others, the ability to imagine the thoughts, beliefs, knowledge, emotion, goals, and desires of others, called as theory of mind. A storyteller must mind read his or her audience to know what information to provide to guide their understanding of the story. Simultaneously, understanding a movie or book requires the ability to autism spectrum condition can uh, state that the narrative characters are needed. Okay, next one. About narrative production and theory of mind. There were several experiments that have attempted to directly examine the relationship between the theory of mind and the ability of produce current narratives. For example, young children who generally perform poor on the tests that require conceptualizing the beliefs of others produce narratives that are skewed toward action rather than thought, and narratives that integrate thought with action only develop with age. Consistent with the theory of the theory of mind development is related to the narrative competence, a direct correlation has been found between the ability to pass classic mentalizing tasks and the level of narrative sophistication as a measure by number of techniques used to engage a listener in typically developing. Among children with autism spectrum condition, performance on the theory of mind task is also correlated with the achievement in narrative production. Okay, the next I would like to explain about narrative production in autism because autism spectrum conditions are characterized in part by specific deficit in theory of mind, which plays a key role in narrative and pragmatic communication. Many experiments have investigated the abilities of children and adolescents with autism spectrum condition to create spoken narratives. In one experiment, then asked to produce fictional narrative children with autism spectrum condition produce a shorter narrative that contained a fewer imaginative elements that neurotypical control. However, they produce a real-life, event-based narratives of similar length to control children. Other researchers have attempted to focus on narrative ability rather than imaginative ability by attempting to minimize the burden of creating content. Typically, these studies elicit storytelling by showing the children either a wordless picture book or some kind of live action display such as a puppet show. Ask them to retell the story that have just been like that. So the participants' responses in these experiments were then coded for length, syntactic complexity, accuracy in recalling key details of the story, and the number and the range of the techniques used to engage the listener in the story. Although most experiments have found no difference in the length or syntactic complexity of narrative produced by the children with autism and controls, recent research has revealed important differences in the ways children with or without with autism spectrum condition construct narrative for their audience. For example, while children with autism spectrum condition use mental state terms as frequently as control, they are more likely to simply the level mental state rather than drawing connections between the mental states and their causes or effects, and are less likely to organize their narratives currently around significant story events. So this result suggests that in addition to providing important of social connective ability in autism, and that analyzing autistic narrative may also be relevant to the weak central coherence theory of autism. This theory proposes that individuals with autism spectrum conditions perceive local details very well but have difficulty seeing in the global big picture. However, in addition to producing narratives of the same length and syntactic complexity as control, children with autism spectrum condition actually have been shown that have no difficulty in incorporating the theme of the story into their narrative. A recent experiment with adults with high-functioning autism or Asperger syndrome also supports this claim. Cole and colleagues presented adults with high-functioning autism as or the same wordless picture book used in the experiments described above. So participants were asked to look through the book and then tell a story based on the picture. The results showed that the while subject in the autism spectrum condition group had no impairments in general storytelling ability, they did demonstrate a specific deficit with regard to the using two types of phrases that take into the account of listeners' need. For example, temporal adverbs and the other terms that reference time provide the listener with a frame of reference in which to consider the event of the story. By using these terms, a storyteller can move the reader temporally through the story, increasing their understanding of the story events and their connection to each other. Similarly, a skilled storyteller avoids using ambiguous pronouns that might confuse their audience but favors using pronouns in disambiguity cases to avoid unnecessary repetition of a given noun phrase, offering the listener more variety and engaging them further in the story. From the strong evidence, people with autism spectrum condition show impairments in the realm of narrative production, and this deficit appears to be specific to pragmatics. In order to tell an engaging story, so we need to take into the account what the listener knows and what kind of presentation that we'll find interesting. We move into the narrative comprehension of autism. Children with autism or learning difficulties are typically developing children with a series of stories that approach the participants' understandings. There are the examples such: there is a girl named Anna is playing inside and breaks a vase. Knowing that her mother will be angry with her for breaking the vase, Anna tells her mother that the dog did it. The children with autism spectrum condition were more likely than either control group to give incorrect example. Anna was joking rather than correct. Anna lied so that she wouldn't get in trouble explanation. While this result certainly reflects a deficit that could affect real-world social processing and functioning, it also shows that the interesting deficit in narrative comprehension, namely individuals with autism spectrum condition, in interpreting the situation incorrectly, seems to be missing out on the core meaning that the scenes are intended. In a related experiment, children were asked why the experimenter produced utterances such as "this is a shoe" while he was pointing at a cup, while typically developing 2-year-olds spontaneously said it was because the experimenters was joking or pretending, thus referring to this mental state. Children with autism said it was because the experimenter was wrong, simply referring to the mismatch between the word and its reference. It can appear the failure. This failure to monitor mental state in communication was also evident in a task of understanding from the Grecian maxims such as be truthful or be relevant or be informative. In the related experiment, children were presented with the possible answer to question and asked it. For example, like this one, where do you live? And the two answers might be I live in England versus I live on the moon. 4-year-old typically developing children were much more accurate in identifying the inappropriate answer compared to young children with autism. So reflecting the typically developing child sensitivity that can appears the speaker's intentional violation. Okay, it can be a variety of other experiments have approved social cognition in autism using stimuli taken from the television or film because film is a multimodal medium. These film stimuli are a closer laboratory approximation of the requirements of real-world processing than are written stories. Across experiments, individuals with autism spectrum conditions show deficit in their ability to autism spectrum condition the correct meaning to interaction in films. In the films like reading the mind in film tasks. So the participants were asked to view short 20-second time film clips and were then given a multiple choice question that asked them to choose which of four words describe a character's mental state or emotion at the end of the clip. Participants with autism spectrum condition performed significantly worse than control to the extent that 90% of participants could be allocated to the correct group based on their performance on this task alone. Okay, the next one. Okay, this is a task of narrative production and comprehension, the moral dilemmas film task. So here, uh, I would like to explain about the moral dilemmas film task and the result of narrative production and the comprehension task. The moral dilemmas film task is a task that uses film narrative as a proxy for real-world social interactions to investigate social understanding in ASC or autism spectrum condition. This test asks participants to view four short naturalistic films clips taken from a modern American television show and write about what they have seen. There are four variables that would be scored in this moral dilemmas film task, namely narrative length, narrative comprehension, narrative production, and quantity modifier. The result of this task also have interesting implications for the study of narrative cognition more broadly. The results are first, okay, the first one, within the control group, there was no correlation between the verbal IQ and any outcome measures, such as the total number of mental state words in their film-based narratives. In contrast, within autism spectrum condition, so, verbal IQ was correlated with the number of mental state terms included in film-based narratives, but was not related to the length of these narratives as a whole. Second, the neurotypical group showed that only a proficiency at the spontaneously thinking about the identifying the unseen thoughts of others, but also a predisposition for communicating the key information to an implied audience. In contrast, though the autism in ASD or autism spectrum condition group that showed an overall bias for paying more attention to mental states than object. This bias was weak compared to controls, and their narratives were shorter, more impoverished, and contain less detail than both control narratives and the narratives they are capable of creating when they must only decide what to say rather than having to decode a social scene and then recreate it on someone else's behalf. The last is the individuals with autism spend more time focused on the mouth region of the face than on the eyes. A region of the face thought to be very important for reading the emotions of others, while individuals in control group show the reverse pattern. Okay, thank you for your watching and please write down your question on the comment. Bye bye.